and we're going to talk about understanding the impact of bullying and self-esteem, but also we'll try to focus on bisexual experiences and bisexual identity. So I look forward for all of us to be with the first session of our amazing research day. Thank you. And I guess we go again. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for being here. For the first panel of today, we're going to talk about bi+ communities, of course, in a larger sense. And we have more than enough time for the presentation that we have, and then we're going to discuss and talk about what it means for us having a bi+ communities. We have many under the bi+ umbrella, and we want to focus our discussion also on the collaboration and not just on differences, and what can we do for ourselves and for our communities together. So please welcome our first presentation of today with Dr. Avanika Sinha and Dr. Deeya, I hope I'm pronouncing this well, Deeya Jain, with their work, The Invisible Scars, Understanding the Devastating Impact of Bullying on Self-Esteem and Social Intimacy Among LGBT Communities in India.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi, hello.
Yeah,
of course, if you have
a
presentation or anything,
yeah.
we can to share the slides.
Yeah. Just a minute. Is it visible? Is the slide visible?
It was.
Right now?
Let's try again. Okay, that's great.
Yeah. Is it? Yeah. Yeah, it's visible now, right?
If you have any ways of making it full screen, so you don't see my.
No, I did try my best, but wasn't able to do that.
That's okay.
Okay. So, hello everyone. Thanks for having me today. I am exploring the effects of bullying on self-esteem and social intimacy of LGBT people in India. So, let me introduce this person. He was my friend back then, and due to bullying, he did die by suicide after so many complaints raised. The school and police did not worked properly for that. Such incidents really happen in India frequently because there are so very few studies in India taking place and talk about homophobic bullying and associated mental health outcomes among the community. So there were a few ROLs which I studied, which indicated that those who were victimized had an issue with social intimacy, poor physical health, financial difficulties, with the family issues as well, like that. And there are so many cultural differences and socioeconomic factors which affect them in their adulthood. Few research studies did provide an example that if we establish some alliances, some rules, some groups, that would reduce in such activities taking place in future. So LGBTQ focused alliances and groups policies are distinctly important here in India as well for the schools and such common places. The aim of this study, another study, was to explore homophobic bullying and including its forms, prevalence, and consequences. It was gathered that the male students were more prone to violence and they were more victimized as compared to female students. But here in India, female students are more bullied in some or the other ways. There are no gender inclusive washrooms, which was the big issue. and the social and emotional impact on victims was higher when social support was low, which is also the scenario here in India, given towards the mental health stigma and the community stigma as well. I explored two variables here, three variables: bullying, self-esteem, and social intimacy. So my first hypothesis was that there is a significant relationship between bullying and social intimacy. The hypothesis two is that there is a relationship between bullying and self-esteem. The methodology I used was snowball sampling, where the sample size was 151 people, including the age of 18 to 48 years. And I asked them to fill the consent form through Google Forms and demographic details. I used these three scales and did the correlation. So the results here were that there was positive correlation between social intimacy and self-esteem. And hypothesis one, as we discussed, was relationship between social intimacy and bullying. However, there was no such thing observed, and thus it was rejected. In hypothesis two, it showed that relationship between self-esteem and bullying. It was observed that there is a significantly negative correlation between the two. So hypothesis two was accepted. So here the limitations were that the sample size was had low generalizability, self-report measures, so the result can be socially desirable. Sample was convenience-based, and it was conducted in a specific region, which is Jaipur, Rajasthan. Future suggestions is that I can increase the sample size, more variables, and other things. So even after this, so many developments in India, as a lot of you might be aware of. So, even after so many developments, LGBT people are still struggling to get the societal validation. Supreme Court judgment has passed so many rules in the recent time, but it can merely pass a resolution. But it is the duty of the society to not discriminate against LGBT or the gender fluidity as such, and make them feel inclusive. The famous politician Shashi Tharoor of India, few people might know. He said, "You don't have to be a cow to fight for animal rights," which was very captivating for me.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted, if everybody want to have some question or about this presentation, about your work, and then maybe I'll ask something myself. And thank you again for your work. Okay, I see nothing on the chat, but then again, thanks for the presentation. Just wanted some quick question, because we know that, for BI+ people, and when we are inside our communities, we try to look for a lot of safer space. It's difficult to have a safe space per se. And we know that BI+ people often are not even welcome in LGBTQIE+ space, because we face biphobia, invisibility, bi-erasure, even in lesbian and gay spaces. And so it could be quite kind of problematic. In your opinion, do you think this kind of also feeling bullying or the idea of facing discrimination inside spaces is something that could be also present in India, or where you have done your research? Because I also saw a bit of Portugal, so I want to know if you think it's something that was who were the people doing the bullying? Is just that would be interesting to know, at least.
Yeah, so there were so many people who had body image issues in my university as well. I did my post-graduation in clinical psychology from Manipal University, Jaipur. So there we did not had any club. So I took forward the idea to formulate a club which we used to know as MEJ Spectrum. So there we used to incorporate the art therapy and dance movement therapy, so that people who had issues along the way, they were we used to incorporate all these therapies to make them feel comfortable, so that they can explore themselves and come up front. and that space was not very welcoming. So this initiative was a really great step in my university. Plus, in India, the stigma is huge. So even as an ally, I was working in this community with the people. I made great friends. So even I used to face so many questions like, why are you going here? Do you identify yourself as something? I'm like, I am working here as an ally. So there's a lot of discrimination going on, even if you are there to support. So there are so many things going on here, and this was the really crucial step. And I think more researches needs to be done here in India, and more steps, support groups should be made.
Thank you. We do have one question from the chat. Were there any surprises that came up in your findings, something you did not expect?
Sorry, your voice was breaking.
No worries. Were there any surprises that came up in your findings, something that was kind of unexpected? Or did their participant let them something else?
Yeah, there were 3 to 4 people, especially 3 to 4 males who were here in Jaipur who belong to a very rural background. Their families do not accept this. So they were here working and they were away from their family. Plus, here in our culture, it is that you surrender yourself to God just because you do not incorporate in the heterosexual way of marriage and the societal expectations. So they surrender themselves to God and they live alone. So there was few things that I came up with that I came across, that they do not want to live with their family. They are coming here in the city, living off on their own and surrendered themselves to God. They don't want to marry, and that's plus they are not even free to explore this area as well, to be with their partners, which is very disheartening to see.
There's a lot of pressure, and yes,
Yeah.
I can imagine there's a lot of pressure to marry, and marriage has become a way even for for express yourself. And we know that there isn't always the possibility even to have the same rights for depending on the gender or the partner that you want to marry. Thank you, James. Cook, there's also another question. And what kind of practical changes in social arrangements would you suggest based on your findings? What can we do?
The government is coming up with new ideas and new rules, which is somewhat favorable towards the community. That's what I want, is that each and every school, each and every university should have gender non-binary washrooms or gender fluid washrooms or whatever they want to call it. But yeah, they should have an inclusive space for that. We should even in the forms, they should add a lot of columns for LGBT community, because there is only male, female, and prefer not to say. So I don't want that. It could be more inclusive in that terms. Plus, there should be support groups, and the sex education is also very important in India. So it should be discussed in schools, in classes, and it should talk on the identity, fluidity, so that if a child of that tender age is confused and is not, everything going around him is not relatable, that a girl is attracted to a boy is attracted to a girl, they should know what is happening around. It is normal, completely okay. It is very confusing from that age, 12, 13, merely. So they should know that this is all normal. They do not have to compile by the heterogeneous expectations.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Thank you again. Yes, I think we can also take this discussion further. Then we'll discuss it all together, because I think that you're right. There's a lot to do, of course, about education and about also practical stuff like gender neutral bathrooms, about places and spaces where you can just be yourself, and it's a complicated matter. But
Yes.
I think also we can discuss later all together.
Yeah, only media is talking about it. So I want that these things should be openly discussed in classes. That way it is coming from informed source.
Yeah. And I think it's also a good point, and then we can talk with anybody who wants to chip in on this. That also, like in research, there's a lot of, we discuss a lot even with supervisors, the people who are not familiar with gender and sexuality studies, like just saying women and men, female and male, other, prefer not to say, that's not representation. Like we know the names, we
Yeah,
know even the umbrella terms,
yeah,
just giving the other option. That's not
yeah. I
representation. If you
don't.
know the name,
Hmm.
use it. I mean, why not?
Yeah,
And
I don't want any other mother to lose a child or any other person to, um, do something like that, because I just lost my friend, and that was a real inspiration for me to do all this and to work extensively in this field.
thank you so much. Okay. We'll move to the next one, and then we'll open the debate and discussion. And I want to welcome James Cook. And please, if you want to talk about your contribution, which is Triune Sociocultural Graphs of Bisexual Identities in a Social Media Environment. Please, James, feel free to also share slides and everything, and welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for making a space for me. So I'm new to this group, and I think as many people did, we find it by searching. So thank you for being there as a group. That's really quite meaningful. I'm going to try to share the screen now. And can you see the screen? All right, super. So what I'm going to try to do is to follow the example of our excellent previous speaker and to say a little bit and then allow for a lot of space for communication. And so what I'm describing is a project that is in process. It's a little ambitious, at least for me, and I would love to hear your feedback on it. And of course, it's standing on the shoulders of a number of people who've come before. So I'd like to be a little reflexive about where I'm coming from. My academic home is sociology. And within sociology, I'm a quantitative sociologist, which simply means I like to fix things in spaces. But within that particularly, my primary domain of research has been social network analysis, mathematical patterns of connection between things that communicate. Usually we think about those in terms of individual people, but we could think about communities that relate to one another. We can also think about ideas that relate to one another in some fashion. And that allows us to connect to ideas like culture. I am myself, I would use the term bisexual, although I know that there have been a lot of debates about that. So I have used the word pansexual before, but I'm bi, and I'm also polyamorous, which is a relationship structure that is non-monogamous among many non-monogamous possibilities. And the data that I'm working with is data that comes from social media. And particularly in this project, I'm looking at data from the platform Reddit. And that's for a few reasons. The first is the major shows that are happening with X and Facebook, Contact You, and where information is no longer freely shared, where identities are threatened. Comparatively speaking, Reddit, which has the classic form of an older school online bulletin board, has a few really important features for marginalized communities. One of those is the use of a pseudonym, and that is standard. People, as a matter of practice on Reddit, do not give their names. So I would typically not give my name as James Cook. It would be something else entirely. And also that the use of identifying information is optional. so that a person can reveal aspects of their identity, or they can leave them obscured, even on their own profile. And even to the point where typically pictures are not used on profiles like photograph pictures, but rather stylized pictures instead. So that gives people the freedom in this presumptively public space to be able to articulate themselves and their ideas without having a researcher come in and have a situation of threat. And I think for poly communities, which I'm interested in, and sexual identities and gender identities, that's very important. So when I'm talking about this complicated word triune, I'm referring to an idea that is at the base of that word, of three things that are not just present as separate objects, but that come together to define something. So within is something larger than themselves. Within sociology, the three objects that I'm interested in talking about are first relations here between people, but also between ideas as networks. And the networks are simply the patterns of relationships where connections are made and also where they are not. And second, groups. We also might refer to other sets such as categories. And those can include identities. Those can also include places in physical space, and they can include identities. The third area for measurement is culture, which is content that flows through groups and also through networks. You'll notice that there are these smaller arrows that move forward from one of these to the other. They're all connected in some ways. And each of those represents a long tradition of social science research that establishes ways in which each affects the other. This is in some ways a qualitative statement, but in many ways, through, for instance, the work of Ronald Breiger going back 50 years, it's also a quantitative relation, so that we know that groups create an environment where cultures can boil in a cauldron, where also connections can happen between individuals, and that people are more likely to be culturally similar if they share groups and if they share relationships. My goal here, ultimately, is to recognize these three measurements in combination, simultaneously measured, so that we can not just understand them separately. So, for instance, I might do a paper individually on groups, or a paper individually on culture, or a paper individually on networks, but also that I might represent the emergent entities that occur when you combine the two. So there are, whenever there are, this is a social network insight, whenever there are three individuals that are together, it's also, by the way, a polyamory insight, there's more than three entities there, right? So every pair of ideas that combine creates a new entity, and the three together create a new entity. So you're thinking, in essence, about 7 different possible social creations. Now that's all abstract and not very applied, but I'm interested in this for a very particular applied reason, which is to think about bisexuality, and to do that by looking at the very largest communities on Reddit for polyamory, which is the polyamory subreddit, and for a different non-monogamous community, which is called swinging, and that's at the polyamory subreddit swingers. These are different models of non-monogamous contact. Polyamory focusing on ideas of love, romantic attachment, swingers, more interested in physical connection. But in looking at both of those, I want to then measure networks. I want to measure groups, and I want to measure culture. So here are a few examples of data that would be collected. You'd look at an adjacency matrix, who is connected to whom, which can be represented in a classic network graph. And that's possible to do, looking at Reddit. Who's talking to who? Who's commenting to whom? Who's sharing with whom? And who isn't sharing with whom? Second, for groups, we can look at two kinds of groupness. The first is to look at organic mentions of groups that individuals are part of. For instance, in the matrix you see in the center, NIN stands for Naughty in New Orleans, which is a swinging event which happens in the city of New Orleans in Louisiana in the United States once a year. And people may indicate, I went there. People may use social media platforms unique for swinging, such as Cassidy. And then they may also identify themselves as having categorical labels, such as polyamory and swinging. And one of the things that we notice that we can do is to think about then not just connections between individuals that occur as they join groups together, and therefore are more likely to come together, but connections between groups. And this is an insight of Ron Breiger, that when groups occur in the universe, they are more connected to one another if they have more people in common. And then finally, over on the right, we can think about culture. And culture can be measured, and I'm showing it here in the traditional form of a data set in which you have cases in rows and variables in columns. So you have categories such as self-professed sexuality, gender categories that individuals list themselves, and then attributes that they associate with these things. But notice that within that data structure, certain attributes like being flirty or being fun can be associated with those sexualities as categories, or gender categories as well. And that's very much like groupness. So then we can think about how these attributes that people describe as being associated with sexual or gender positions, how they can be closer to or farther from one another depending on the categories that they hold in common. Or conversely, do the categories become closer to each other or more distant from one another based on the categories that they have in common? And so that's my goal, to look at all three of these at once, and then to be able to answer emerging questions. To do what? To characterize this community from the ground up, and to let it characterize itself, and let those characterizations emerge. So from that, we can begin to answer a number of questions about different aspects of this social structure. One of the things that we can do, this is a picture of the polyamory community in February of 2023, where connections here are seen as arrows, that is, people responding to other people. You notice that there are people who are in the center, there are people who are on the periphery, people who are being more deeply included in conversation, people who are being excluded from conversation. And so we can then ask questions like, well, are gender identities, sexual identities, different communities and groups, and cultural similarities associated with the connections that you see here in this picture? Or are they entirely unassociated with them? A second question that we can begin to ask is, well, are these stated communities separate communities, or is that overblown, right? We've all heard, and let me pause here for a moment. And actually, I'll stop the share because I'd like to hear from you in this regard. When you think about communities of swingers and communities of people involved in polyamory, and you think about bisexual identities in those groups, what are the stories that you've heard about those kinds of groups? What do you hear? And I'd like to throw that out to folks just for a moment. Any thoughts? Any things you've heard? Stories you've heard?
Let's see if anybody wants to break the ice for this.
I see Hugo.
Yes,
and Helen.
Hugo, and then Helen.
Yeah, I'll go. We need to hear people's voices more. I think what I've heard a lot about the swingers community is that it was a lot more heterosexual. And I'm more in contact with the poly communities than the swinger. Right? I'm not in contact really with the swinger community. That bisexuality in women is welcome, but it's also quite fetishizing, and that bisexuality in men tends to be very taboo in a lot of circles. Not necessarily everywhere, but that's what I've heard about it.
Thank you, Hugo. Helen.
Hi, thanks. Just checking that I was unmuted. Yeah, really interesting. Just picking up on a discussion that's starting to emerge in the comments. Mona has started this, but talked about classism as something that comes up around polyamory and swinging research. And that's something that really strikes me in the UK context, is that polyamory certainly seems to be seen as much more of a middle class thing, and swinging as much more of a working class thing. There was some really interesting work being done on this probably 10 or 15 years ago in the UK by Meg Dawn Barker and Dee MacDonald, who looked at some of the kind of class discourse around swinging stuff, swinging versus polyamory. And I just wondered whether that had come up in any of your research, because that is just definitely something that strikes me about things that one hears in the UK context about poly versus swinging is that you get this idea that swinging is all about the sex, and swinging is particularly about women. As Hugo said, it's okay for women to be bi, but you don't see so much interaction between the guys. That's very much the stereotype and here. And I just wondered, I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Well, yeah, actually, Helen, thank you. And Hugo, thank you as well. I mean, so these are some of the things that also emerge in tales that are told. So for women, particularly in swinging, bisexuality is presumed. And in fact, it may be imposed. Whereas in communities, especially in swinging, the story is that if you're a bisexual man, it must be hidden. And if you're found out, you're actually going to be physically excluded from participating, if that's the best thing that will happen to you. The story within the polyamory community is that bisexuality and queerness of various sorts are more embraced and more supported. Aurelio, you had your hand up. I want to let you jump in.
Don't worry. Please finish the sentence. That's not a problem. Then I will.
Oh, that was the finish of my thought. Please go ahead.
Because I also agree on this. While doing my research on BIPOC communities, but also I did some work on straight people, or people at least who identify as straight. And there's a lot of people using the words open couple in a very creative way. Although they usually, it's like one of the most difficult relationship agreement to partake. One of the people actually claim to be doing so much, especially in straight context, especially in groups and everything. So I wanted to ask you two things. Like one, if in your opinion, there's also some Reddits or spaces where people discuss this, because in my opinion, it's like the least type of discussion that these people engage. They say, we can open the couple, we can open the relationships, but they never look for anything, any resources. They don't read usually anything about this, but they just go with the flow, and it goes terribly. This is one. And then we have our Derek that asked, with the possibility of a small sample sizes, are the network models affected, such as zero-inflated models or Poisson distribution? So we go also the kind of quantitative question and specialized.
Yep, sure.
And if you can answer a bit of that and a bit on the classes that Mona Griesberg actually was asking
Yes.
about.
So absolutely. So a few things. First, Derek, this is possibly a little bit easier. This is actually one of the benefits of studying a community like Reddit. Every network has a boundary, right? We can't study all 8 billion people simultaneously, so there's always some exclusion. However, within the boundary of the social media platform, it's a population rather than a sample, especially if you go in and you collect on a daily basis. You can even catch posts that are deleted. And that's important because when you have a network sample, you're going to have missing data, and it's worse than for an individual level data set because you're talking about multiple possible connections that you don't know anything about. But second, right, I have heard about ideas of class. So that these are things that take a lot of effort to work with. Also have heard a lot about the different, a lot of stories about the experience of individual bisexual people in the swinging environment versus the poly environment, feeling included versus excluded. But stories have a limitation, right? We curate our stories, right? We tell our stories, and they're really valuable from an individual level. But one first level check, which as far as I've seen has not occurred in the research literature, is to say, is there a more general pattern that occurs? The third problem with stories is that when we come in and we have pre-existing ideas, like ideas of bisexuality as this is our label, as opposed to other labels that people might use, is that you might lose things. So for that reason, just to finish what I'm doing, that's why I'm looking at data. So I'm then able to answer questions like, well, are these two distinct communities? There's an area of overlap here. You can see 122 people who are involved in swinging discussions are also involved in polyamory discussions. So not completely separated, but with large majorities engaged in different kinds of work, or in different kinds of discussion, excuse me. We can take these stories that have been described, distinguishing poly versus swinging people, the experience of bisexual people in these two communities, and we can actually test them by looking at them. So one of the things we can do, if, for instance, if just to give a quick overview, because I don't want to dominate the rest of the hour, is that swingers are said to have dyads and loose networks where they form connections and then dissolve them. Do we see that difference, therefore, in network density? We see a moderate one, but they're roughly the same size. And there's a lot of reciprocation that occurs in both. Here's, for me, the one slide that is what I'm aiming for. Going into these communities, asking people, not asking, but observing in public, these are all public statements, how do they identify themselves? What are the labels that they use? Poly, hetero, situationally bi. So there's another one that you see here emerging. These are the large boxes. And then the small boxes are all of the expectations that are communicated through the discussion about what people like that are like. And then if we allow those descriptions to form the glue between those categories, we can then imagine the creation of a space in which we see some of those labels have a more similar kind of depiction and others are quite different. Some of the difficulties that I see is that some of the less common frequency-wise labels, because they occur less often, such as at the bottom, a poly, bisexual, non-binary person, that occurs relatively infrequently. So I'm getting less description, as you can see, of what the experience of a person like that is like. But within those limitations, I'm hoping to let people speak for themselves, to let their accumulated stories show us the patterns that emerge. And by the way, I do just want to say, if you're going to read one thing, I don't want to give you like tiny little 14-point font that you can't read. Sarah Sugars has a great new piece out on just this kind of approach called Semantic and Cultural Networks. It's the only piece of writing that I didn't have to read 6 times in order to understand, that is also technical and quantitative. So let me stop sharing there, but thank you.
Thank you, James, for
Yeah.
the great presentation and all the insights. And we still have a few minutes, so I think we can just even some suggestions, because we've talked, thank you to Deeya again, and because we talked about bi-plus communities, we talked about poly communities. So we have, of course, later in the afternoon, at least time zone here, we'll also discuss again about bi-plus spaces and sport. But I think what we need is definitely more research on the variety of different identities and how we negotiate our relationship. Just have some final thoughts. If anybody wants to suggest or chip like any things that we want to see in research on bi-plus communities, and that would be something that we can discuss just in these last few minutes. So
I see a great question from Ellen Davenport Pleasance. Yeah, and that's I'm sorry, Aurelio, your audio just.
Please go. Yeah, please. Just what do you think are the differences between people who are poly engaged in swinging and chose to use Reddit and those who don't?
Yes, this is connected to issues of class. Whenever you're talking about an online environment, that's going to invoke class. Whenever you're talking about an English language site, that's going to also exclude. So it's really important to point out that whatever I do find is not going to be generalizable to the overall population of people, but it is a population of people. So that's the stance I take going back. These are large communities of people who do talk about it, and that's a step forward. While we also have to recognize, oh, absolutely, and I'm seeing Ariane, Aurelio, and Hugo are pointing this out. This is not all by people by any stretch of the imagination. So then the challenge would be, how do you find people, right? And this is classic in areas of research for vulnerable populations who don't actually feel comfortable emerging. These are people in some way who also feel comfortable emerging. Yeah. And unfortunately, T asks if I have any information about how race plays in this. Not yet. There are discussions within swinging, some of them highly racialized, and I have not found large quantities of discussion that are also simultaneously talking about sexual identity, such as being hetero, cis, or non-binary, or bisexual. So I'm not finding the overlap yet.
Thank you, James. Hugo, for the last question before we close for a small break before the next session.
Yeah. I'm one of the co-founders of r/bisexual men on Reddit and its affiliated Discord. And a question that we're always wondering about, they're called lurkers in message board language, Reddit language. The people who are there who read a lot but never post. And I was wondering how, if you have strategies in your research to account for that, because our stance is that reading is participating. So I was wondering if you had strategies to account for that in your research for the people who are not necessarily posting anything, but go there like frequently, read a lot of stuff, and that's their involvement in the community, and how you would track that.
Super. Hugo, by the way, I first want to mention I'm a subscriber or follower and regular reader of Bisexual Men. So thank you for doing what you do there. There's a lot of identity work that goes on there in that subreddit. Absolutely. So my empirical answer is no. I am not measuring that at all because, and I actually consider that an advantage. I do not have access beyond the public presentation of these pseudonymous individuals. And I don't want to, right? Because that would create a lot of opportunities for things to go really wrong. So it's an ethical plus, and it's a measurement minus. Methodologically speaking, I feel a little comfortable with that, knowing that anytime you study a network of people or a community of people, that involves distinction, drawing a boundary. And empirically speaking, that's my boundary. And I just need to say, I know I'm not studying everyone, and that there's going to be a large community of lurkers behind that, and we never see their words. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Before going to the next